This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. The Red Line is now in its 5th year as a program, which again, absolutely blows my mind. And seeing as it had been 5 years, I started flicking back through some of these old episodes. And what was really interesting to see when flicking through some of these old episodes is just how much the geopolitics of the world has changed in this 5 years, and the impact that some of these changes have had retrospectively on some of these episodes, as well as some of our past topics like how terrorist groups are funded, or the effectiveness of economic sanctions, the black market for nuclear weapons, or even the Thai drug trade have all held up remarkably well. Other episodes like the cyber war in Ukraine, Russia's Pacific strategy, or the war in the Arctic have all been somewhat overtaken by the geopolitics of the time, and these days could probably do with an updated version. However, even out of all 130 episodes, there were 3 that pretty desperately needed an update. Number 1, obviously being our first episode on the war in Ukraine, as that episode was taped back in January of 2021, and I don't know if you've been following the news, but things have slightly changed since then. The second and third, episodes 17 and 31 respectively, both focused on Armenia, Azerbaijan, and the conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh. As while our first Karabakh piece laid out the history, our second Nagorno-Karabakh piece was released in November 2020, just a few days after the Second Karabakh War, where after what had been a stalemate for nearly 3 decades, had just been shattered by Azerbaijan using these newfangled drones called TB2s to absolutely decimate the Armenian military, conquering the majority of the territory around Nagorno-Karabakh and reducing an area that was around 1/6 of Azerbaijan's territory down to just a small patchwork of villages surrounded by Azeri troops and artillery with a single military corridor connecting them to the rest of Armenia. And that's where we left the last piece we did on Karabakh. Now, going back through the ending monologue of that episode, we ended that episode talking about the precarious position that Armenia found itself in, with the Armenians now vulnerable to having their territory overrun within just a few days, and a permanent sword of Damocles hanging over the territory. We even made a stark warning at the end of that episode that if Russian peacekeepers were to ever leave the territory, it would only be a matter of time before Azerbaijan would move again to capture the rest of Karabakh. And because we were less cautious back then, we even made the bold call that within 5 years, Azerbaijan was likely to make another move in the area. And whilst most of those predictions ended up coming true, where we did get it wrong was just how long Karabakh had left. As within 6 months of that episode airing, Azerbaijan began occupying small villages and towns along the Armenia-Azerbaijan border. A month after that, clashes started kicking off between Armenia and the Azeri presence in Nakhchivan. And then just a little while after that, Russia would launch its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And just like our worst fears coming true, the Russian peacekeepers did end up being pulled off that corridor connecting Karabakh to the rest of Armenia. And as expected, over the following months, Armenia closed the corridor and initiated a siege on the remaining villages that would last for around 6 months. And although it was 803 days before our predicted 5-year mark, Azerbaijan took advantage of the situation, moved in and seized the remaining parts of Karabakh in a conflict that lasted less than 2 days. On the day we aired that previous piece in 2020, the Armenian population remaining within Karabakh was around 150,000. But today, as we air the follow-up, the Armenian population is less than 50. Not 50,000, 50. As with the Azeris occupying the area, almost the entire Armenian population was forced to relocate back into Armenia proper. And the crazy bit is, that's not even all the changes that have happened in this region, as just over that 5-year period, we've seen Russia's influence in the region dramatically shrink, we've seen Turkey and Israel become more powerful and more assertive in the region, and Iran step in to take on the peacekeeping role that Russia once used to, and prevent another war from occurring in this region of the world. And we've even reached a point where not only are France and India the largest arms suppliers for the Armenians these days, but Baku is now openly confrontational with Paris regarding its position here in the South Caucasus. The situation is almost unrecognizable from where we left off just a few short years ago in November of 2020. So how much has actually changed? How much is still the same? And what does the future look like for Armenia's relationships with Russia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Iran, Georgia, and the EU? Well, those are just some of the questions we're going to be answering here today. And to help us explain how we got here, and how Yerevan found itself in this position, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. An Island in the Mountains.
Armenia's history basically can make it into several volumes just because it's so nuanced, and people tend to say that when you have 3 Armenians in a room, they will have 5 opinions and all of them will be right.
Olesa Vartanyan is an independent expert and regional security analyst specializing in the South Caucasus. Having previously worked with a number of prestigious research institutes, Olesa now produces research and analysis on the changing dynamics currently taking place between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. So, we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
Armenia kind of functions and operates with lots of problems, with new security challenges. And that has to do not only with the fact that at the moment the Soviet Union collapsed, Armenia had nothing really to provide or to sell, except some very traditional things like vegetables or fruits. And in addition to that, Armenia's own infrastructure was in a very poor shape. And some of the things like distribution system of electricity or the gas supply system, the country basically did not have any kind of energy resources for quite some time. So I personally heard lots of stories from people how they had to go into the street even while living in the capital, and then they would cut the trees just to heat their houses because there was no electricity and there was no natural gas coming to Armenia for quite some time.
Now, before we get any further into it, I think it's probably worth setting a bit of the geography out here so everyone understands where everything else is. And with this being an audio format, we're going to have to use our imagination here. Now, we've covered this in detail in other episodes, but to start with, I want you to imagine 4 tall rectangles, all side by side. And starting from right to left, rectangle 4 on the very eastern edge, well, that's Azerbaijan, with Azerbaijan being on the Caspian Sea coast. Now, if we go one rectangle to the left, moving west to rectangle 3, well, there we'd find Armenia, being landlocked and nestled in the mountains. Now, if we then move westward again to rectangle 2, we'd find Nakhchivan, which is actually a part of Azerbaijan, but separated from the rest of the country by Armenia. And then on the very far left, rectangle number 1, that's the far eastern edge of Turkey. So from left to right, Turkey, then Azerbaijan, then Armenia, and then the rest of Azerbaijan. Now that we have our 4 tall rectangles, so running along the entire bottom edge of our 4 rectangles, well, that would be Iran. And running along the entire top of our 4 rectangles, well, that would be Georgia. And then running on top of Georgia, well, that'd be Russia. Okay, so now we have that sorted, we can move on to the rest of history. Now, we have talked about Armenia before, specifically Armenia's relationship between Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Russia, even covering some of Armenia's history, like its separation from the Ottoman Empire, the Russian support for their independence, and the eventual annexation 2 years later of Armenia into the Soviet Union. So if you're looking for a more in-depth history about Armenia, you can check out those pieces. Because for now, we're going to focus a little bit more on Armenia's modern history. But to give you a bit of a brief overview so everyone's at least up to scratch, if we go back to just the 1980s, tensions between the Armenian SSR and the Azeri SSR really began to spark off, particularly over the issue that is Nagorno-Karabakh. As while we had our 4 rectangles from left to right, we need to complicate those even further, as inside rectangle number 4, the very far right one, inside that rectangle is a province called Nagorno-Karabakh, a province within the UN-recognized borders of Azerbaijan that was populated entirely by ethnic Armenians. So obviously, Armenia staked a claim on the territory. So in 1991, when the two sides gained independence, both Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, and Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, began making moves to change the reality on the ground. And during the chaos, launching a full-scale war to conquer and occupy Nagorno-Karabakh. Both sides at the time were pretty poorly armed, and the Armenians were successful in their endeavor, capturing not only Nagorno-Karabakh, but also the surrounding areas, allowing Nagorno-Karabakh to be directly connected to the rest of Armenia. So now imagine the bottom left-hand corner of rectangle number 4 now being occupied and aligned with rectangle number 3. The two sides would eventually reach a ceasefire in 1994, but the issue remained unresolved, with both sides still staking claim to the territory, and it became a massive issue for both sides, with Armenia writing Karabakh into its constitution and Azerbaijan putting Karabakh on its money. And it was during this period that the rhetoric between the two sides became incredibly venomous. But things stayed at a standstill. Events on the ground outside of a few tiny skirmishes stayed relatively stable, with a lot of that being due to Russia, as at the time Russia still had a very significant role here in the South Caucasus, particularly within Armenia. After all, Armenia had joined most of its organizations, including its military alliance, the CSTO. Russia held bases on Armenian territory, and was by far the largest military supplier to both sides, supplying between about 94 to 97% of all of Armenia's military supplies at that point in time. So despite Armenia being squeezed between Turkey and Azerbaijan, Armenians felt relatively safe, knowing that Russia had vowed to, on paper, defend them. However, the first cracks in this relationship really began to appear in about 2008, during the start of the Russo-Georgian War. Now, we haven't got time to cover too much about the Russo-Georgian War here, and we have an entire Patreon stream going through it if you want to check that out. But after Russia had gone into Georgia, won a pretty decisive victory on the ground, and effectively codified Georgia's two breakaway states, what was Armenia's response to these events, and how did it affect their relationship going forward?
During the war in 2008, Armenia was kind of doing everything possible to avoid being dragged directly into the conflict. And that could happen because there was this Russian military base located in Armenia, not very far from the border with Georgia. There was speculated that Russia at some point could activate its military presence in Armenia in order to make the Georgian leadership surrender. But it did not become necessary during the 5-day war. The Georgian leadership basically gave up, even without seeing more Russian military being activated to its south. The other thing that Armenia really was very passionate about is, of course, the supply roads. Basically, all the trade between Armenia and Russia, it happens through Georgia. And then when the war started happening, either because of the military activities or due to the security situation just in general, the supply roads, they got blocked. And then that became a huge problem to the Armenian businesses and also to the Armenian state. I remember reading some of the WikiLeaks, for example, where the US officials, they were trying to mediate between Tbilisi and Yerevan about some of the wheat supplies, just so that the Armenians could have bread in Yerevan. Luckily, everything was more or less resolved without any kind of open conflict and confrontation. And everything that kind of all the debates and discussions or any kind of concerns that were at that time, they mainly stayed in offices. But what followed was much more interesting in that sense, because certainly the Russian presence in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and then Russia's decision to recognize these two Georgian breakaway regions, they in a way supported the Armenian cause for Nagorno-Karabakh. Armenians, they were demanding the need to recognize Nagorno-Karabakh, or what they call Artsakh. But it was very short-lived because the moment Russia stationed its military in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, it right away seized all the hopes for any kind of potential cooperation or opened the roads through these breakaways and the discussions that were going on before 2008. I remember talking to one former senior de facto official in Abkhazia and how he was describing to me the interest that the Armenian leadership kept in, for example, seeing the resumed work of the railroad that goes through Abkhazia, then through Georgia proper, and then this railroad connects basically Armenia to Russia via Abkhazia and Georgia proper. And then just because Russia recognized Abkhazia and South Ossetia, there were no more hopes that railroad could function anytime soon. On top of that, there were also the problems with other transportation roads that connect Russia with Armenia. Like, for example, it took several years.
The end result of all this being that any goods brought into Armenia from Russia would either need to enter the country via road, making it much more expensive and much more inefficient, or if transported by rail, would have to enter Azerbaijan and then into Georgia before entering into Armenia, increasing costs of Russian goods and introducing new problems into the Armenian supply chain. So why is it then that after the 2008 events, we still see Armenia pushing full steam ahead with its relationship with Russia?
The main reason why we started seeing Armenia getting back and closer to the Russian interest and orbit is basically its continued problems with Azerbaijan and Turkey. Unfortunately, we got the situation when the war in Nagorno-Karabakh that started in the early 90s, it led to the problem that in 1993, Turkey, they closed the border with Armenia. That led to the decision that the leadership at that time, they had to take, and they signed with agreement that allowed the stationing of the Russian military base in Gyumri, which is a big town in the west of Armenia, right next to the border with Turkey. When it comes to Azerbaijan, unfortunately, the conflict with Nagorno-Karabakh got never resolved, and then it has lasted for over 25 years with regular clashes and incidents. All the diplomatic efforts to somehow seal a deal or to find a way to proceed with some confidence-building measures, they led nowhere. One after another, we saw the failure in this negotiation process between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And until 2020, when Azerbaijan retook parts of Nagorno-Karabakh and basically resolved much of the problem, at least for that very moment, Armenia was absolutely handcuffed when it comes to its security, and it always had to think twice before taking any sort of move toward the West, because at any moment it could provoke the problems with Russia that, at least formally, for a very long time remained Armenia's key foreign ally and then also provider of the security.
This effectively brings us from 2008 going forward, this particular decade being a pretty impactful one. Now, over that time, a lot of things changed for both Armenia and Azerbaijan, the most obvious being the national GDP changes due to Azerbaijan becoming an oil and gas powerhouse, particularly for the European markets. And just taking a look at GDPs, if we start in 2010, Armenia is bringing in about 9.26 billion a year, and Azerbaijan bringing in about 52.9 billion a year. But then across the next decade, by 2020, Armenia's economy had grown by about 16 billion to reach 25 billion, but the Azeri economy had grown by a whopping 25 billion, bringing it to $78 billion per year. The Armenians had a lot more to spend on defense, purchasing large numbers of Israeli equipment and Turkish drones. And this effectively brings us into 2020 and the Second Karabakh War. Now, while there had been skirmishes between these two across that decade, 2020 was unlike anything anyone had seen before, as on the 27th of September 2020, Azerbaijan began an offensive aimed at capturing the majority of Artsakh, with Armenia's comparatively outdated Russian equipment suffering pretty badly in the face of Turkish drones. A lesson the defense planners in Kiev were probably taking pretty close notes of. The conflict lasted just over a month, with several thousand people being killed. But the overall outcome was an overwhelming Azeri victory, with the final days of the campaign being characterized by Azeri forces closing in on Stepanakert, the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh, and beginning a pincer movement to cut off the last corridor connecting Nagorno-Karabakh to the rest of Azerbaijan. And in the end, the only thing that prevented them from closing the gap was that Russia stepped in at the last moment, placing its own peacekeepers inside the Lachin corridor. Now, we've covered this in a lot more detail in our previous episode, which came out just after these events, so you can go check that one out. But for now, let's take a bit of a look back on it, and I want to try and understand, why do you think the Russians did intervene at the last moment? Why not intervene at the very start of the conflict, or just let Azerbaijan win at that point?
I think one of the main reasons Russia was very much distracted with developments in Syria, but the other thing is that Russia did not really anticipate anything like this coming in Armenia. On the one hand, they also got their own problems with the Armenian former leadership of Sarkisyan. There were some disagreements and then disputes, especially related to the way how some of the projects should be happening.
The man you're referring to there is Nikol Pashinyan, the current Prime Minister of Armenia, a man who has a somewhat complicated relationship with Moscow. You see, Pashinyan came up through Armenian politics as a journalist and editor for one of Armenia's opposition newspapers, one that was pretty critical of the previous Russia-aligned governments. And during his time as a journalist, he'd faced numerous legal troubles and even imprisonment for his political activism. On top of that, he was also pretty vocal about rallying against Russian interference inside Armenian politics, whilst also not going as far as to say Russia should be ejected from the country. But when in 2018 Pashinyan led the Velvet Revolution, and through a peaceful protest that led to the resignation of the previous Prime Minister, Pashinyan was now the Prime Minister of Armenia, riding into office on a wave of anti-corruption sentiment and demands for more democratic reforms to take place within Armenia. So, as you can probably imagine, Putin was somewhat skeptical about Pashinyan. So, during 2020, when the Second Nagorno-Karabakh war kicked off, and Pashinyan would turn back toward Moscow for help, Putin was arguably a little bit slow to pick up the phone. So can you elaborate a bit more on this relationship between the two of them?
When people come to power through a kind of public revolts like this, they were kind of formally welcome. There was never a real love between Vladimir Putin and Nikol Pashinyan. They kind of cooperated, they continued talking, but you never saw any kind of chemistry going on between the two guys. But Armenia, by that time, was so much dependent on Russia economically and also in terms of security because of Nagorno-Karabakh.
Pashinyan's relationship with Putin wasn't the only one to suffer a bit over the years as well, as whilst Pashinyan would come into office with a wave of popularity, even enjoying a local approval rating of around 85% in May and September of 2018, that approval rating would quickly start to fall away. And by 2019, with the honeymoon period over, it had dropped to around 70% approval. But by the end of 2020, his approval rating would drop to just 31%, falling to 30% by 2022, down to 13% by 2023, and currently now hovering around 17% approval. So what happened? How did this leader, who only a couple of years beforehand came into power on this wave of populism, lose public support so quickly?
It all started in 2020 when Armenia lost the war to Azerbaijan, and then basically Azerbaijani forces started establishing new positions along much longer Armenian-Azerbaijan border. And then this was a time when the Armenian leadership made another attempt to getting closer to Russia. So it started inviting more Russian presence, and not just in form of the Russian peacekeepers in Nagorno-Karabakh, but also the Russian border guards and the Russian military along the Armenian-Azerbaijani border. And it did not lead anywhere. We started seeing still more escalation taking place along the front lines, and then both in Nagorno-Karabakh and along the border. And all of that has been affecting Armenia. I mean, the biggest problem for Armenia, especially since the 2020 war, is with profound fear of a new attack from Azerbaijan, which can turn Armenia into pieces and also drive its population outside to some neighboring countries, and then probably will just reinforce this whole question, basically, whether Armenia will be able to continue existing as the sovereign state. In this very environment, Nikol Pashinyan, he was absolutely destroyed in terms of his popularity in 2020. No one wanted to see him. Even people from his close leadership, they either got attacked and almost killed, or they had to hide in their houses just because it was so unpopular what happened in 2020. But Nikol Pashinyan, he was able to still find a way to again secure his kind of agreement, I would say a temporary agreement with Russia, and on the other hand, to start campaigning inside the country.
So if Pashinyan's approvals are so low, why is it that he's been able to maintain office?
Some say that because there is no alternative to Nikol Pashinyan. And then there were the cases when people took to the streets just because some blogger called on them and said that this is the time for you to protest. And then with sporadic protests, they do take place in Armenia. In my many visits and conversations throughout all these years with different people in different regions, I can definitely sense a growing disappointment with the current Armenian leadership. And that disappointment, it comes not only from the fact that Armenia lost the war in 2020 or what happened to Nagorno-Karabakh, and not even only because of a standing security concern that come from Azerbaijan. But it also comes from the fact that people want to continue seeing a better life. They want to continue to see development in their country. With small businesses, they want to continue growing. And then in order for this to happen, you also have to find a way to attract new investment, which will not happen unless you seal a deal with Azerbaijan and Turkey and you secure the situation in your country. And I would say that the upcoming couple of years in Armenia are going to be really very interesting because Armenia will be having parliamentary election in 2026, and this will be probably the biggest test for the current Armenian leadership, whether they will be able to secure their power and then to secure their victory, to stay in power. And for this to happen, they definitely need to find a way to seal a deal with Azerbaijan so that they can somehow prevent or minimize the chance of a new attack. If they are able to do that, then they probably can open the border, which can allow more cheaper products and also more investment into the country. If none of this happens, which again, very much in the hands of Azerbaijan, then the current Armenian leadership is going to face a really very challenging political situation inside their country, because they will definitely continue having more security problems, more people asking questions why they live in poverty and why their life is not getting better.
So that pretty much brings us to our current position, right where we kicked off at the end of the intro, with Karabakh being conquered and now under complete Azeri control, with Turkey and Azerbaijan becoming more emboldened than ever before, and the only country seemingly going to bat for Armenia being Iran, who, frankly, right now is also dealing with its own issues. But Armenia is still key to Russia's interest. It offers connections into Georgia, Iran, and an incredibly important airbase for operations throughout Syria. So what is Russia's role here moving forward? Is this the death of the Armenian-Russian relationship, or do the stats tell us something else? What is rhetoric, and what is real? Well, to answer that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. The Marriage to Moscow.
In 2022, the country was still reeling from defeat in the Second Karabakh War in 2020, but there were a number of additional factors that helped to further rupture the country's pre-existing security paradigm.
Lawrence Brewers is an associate fellow of the Russia and Eurasia program for Chatham House, specializing in conflict, peace, and governance in the South Caucasus. In addition to his role with Chatham House, he's also the co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of Caucasus Survey, the first dedicated scholarly journal for the Caucasus region, as well as being the author of the books Armenia and Azerbaijan, Anatomy of Rivalry, and Armenia's Velvet Revolution, Authoritarian Decline and Civil Resistance in a Multipolar World. So we're thrilled to have Lawrence back on the program today.
So these were the recurring escalations and incursions from Azerbaijan coming across the international border now with Armenia, so not military action contained to Nagorno-Karabakh. Notably, in September 2022, there was what might be described as a two-day war, large-scale Azerbaijani attacks across the border, hitting targets in Armenia. Linked to that was the final collapse of Armenia's deterrent system. So in the face of these attacks, Russia and the Collective Security Treaty Organization essentially did nothing.
So I think one of the questions I hear quite often around this subject is, why didn't Armenia push back against these incursions? As an example, why didn't they even deploy their new Russian jets against these Azeri attackers? Now, I do understand that losses were incredibly heavy from the 2020 conflict, particularly when it comes to equipment, and that Russian replacement parts and munitions were pretty hard to get a hold of after 2022. but it seemed that 2020 was the last time that Armenia would launch a concerted counterattack. As Armenia would not launch an offensive to widen the Lachin corridor, it didn't attempt any offensive when the Lachin corridor's control was handed over from the Russians to the Azeris in December 2022, or even when the Azeris finally sealed off the corridor in March of 2023, under the guise of environmental concerns. There was also no Armenian response when there were new skirmishes up and down the Armenian border, and Azeri jets and drones buzzing in and out of Armenian airspace. And there was also no response when by September 2023, after most of the international journalists had left, and the Armenian population living within Karabakh had been effectively cut off from supplies over almost a year, Azerbaijan would launch its last massive offensive in the region, quickly overwhelming and overrunning what remained of Karabakh, with the Armenian garrison stationed inside the pocket surrendering within just 48 hours. All of this being followed by Baku issuing a series of pretty chilling orders, offering the Armenian population inside the pocket only a short window of time to flee back into Armenia proper, as whoever remained within the pocket at the end of the period would now be under Azerbaijani control. And as such, within just a few days, what had been a population of 120,000 Armenians at the start of the week ended with just 50 Armenians remaining by the end of the week. Baku had effectively cleaned the Armenians out. So I guess the question I ask is, why didn't Armenia push back at any of these points? Was it that they didn't want to? Was it that the pressure was put on them not to? Or did they simply just not have the capacity to push back against an army that had been well supplied and well equipped by both Turkey, Israel, and a substantial windfall of European gas market money?
I think with regard to the Russian peacekeepers, I mean, we just don't know, but there may have been some kind of quid pro quo. That's the speculation. But I think at that point, for Nikol Pashinyan to have mounted some kind of a military operation, I think would have been very unlikely. The Armenian armed forces are in disarray. Azerbaijan had demonstrated its military superiority in many of these escalations, including in this 2-day conflict in September. So I think there was simply very little coercive capacity to fight back. With regard to the local Karabakh Armenian forces, obviously there had been this blockade, the interdicting of access to Armenia. You had a weakened population. So I think you can see this whole era of the blockade since December 2022 as being part of a phased campaign to weaken the population in advance of a military strike.
So a lot of this goes against what many expected the Russians would do here in Armenia. After all, the Russians had made very contradictory statements in the past. As an example, I want to quote Andrei Rozinsky, the Russian colonel currently in charge of the 3,000 men strong garrison sitting in Armenia, operating under the command of the 102nd base. Now, Andrei took command of this garrison back in 2012, and a few years later made the quote, "If Azerbaijan decides to restore jurisdiction over Karabakh by force, the Russian military base may join the armed conflict in accordance with both federal obligations and the CSTO." Given that this statement was from the same man who was in charge during all of these events, why do you think the Russians didn't get more involved?
Well, I remember that he made that statement and then, nothing actually happened in practice. So I think prior to 2020, the Russian strategy was what I would call one of pivotal deterrence. Pivotal deterrence is when a larger third-party state tries to prevent two other states from going to war by creating a lot of ambiguity and confusion about what it might do in the event of a war between them, thereby deterring them from taking action. And I remember that statement in 2013, and thinking about that as, this fits with this perfectly, because you have really contradictory signals coming from the Gyumri base, from the Russian president, from the foreign minister, creating this sort of sense of ambiguity about what Russia might actually do in the event of a war. The answer was that Russia didn't do anything.
Russia's decision to stand by and let these protests erupt across Yerevan must have felt like a slap in the face to Armenia, not only from Russia, but also from its fellow CSTO members. The CSTO being Russia's regional security alliance, including Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Armenia. Now, admittedly, Armenia couldn't invoke Article 4 in 2020, as the CSTO's collective security provision, somewhat akin to NATO's Article 5 provision, where an attack on one is considered an attack on all. But within this provision, much like NATO's, it can only really be triggered when a state's internationally recognized borders are attacked. And although Nagorno-Karabakh was ethnically Armenian and had Armenian troops within the pocket, it is still internationally recognized as a part of Azerbaijan, therefore allowing everyone in the CSTO a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card here. So in the 2020, Armenia couldn't invoke Article 4, something that most of the policymakers in Yerevan understood. However, coming out of the Karabakh campaign into 2021, Azerbaijan began upping the tempo, occupying border villages like Sayonik and Jigakahunik. And while these aren't textbook cases of when Article 4 could be invoked, Russia would convince Yerevan not to, stating that these were small villages, often with high populations of Azeris, and Russia would convince Yerevan to drop the case, as well as the subsequent incursions into border towns in July and November of that year. All of this would be particularly frustrating for Armenia, with Armenia not long after that also taking the rotating chair of the CSTO. So in January 2022, with multiple towns being occupied by the Azeris and protests still occurring against the government in Yerevan, massive protests broke out across Kazakhstan. And when President Tokayev of Kazakhstan would call Russia for help, contrary to how it treated Armenia, Russia would quickly step up and come to the aid of Kazakhstan, rallying the CSTO nations and deploying a force that included 100 Armenians into Kazakhstan. And whilst this would temporarily show the strength of the CSTO, just a month later Russia would launch its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and what remaining focus it had on Armenia very quickly drained away, eventually even having its peacekeepers step aside in late 2022 and handing the management of the Lachin corridor over to Turkey and Azerbaijan. Two countries, one would argue, didn't always have Armenia's best interests at heart. So what I want to know is, why didn't the CSTO get more involved during the 2020 conflict, or even the 2021 incursions, or even the 2022 closing of the Lachin corridor? Isn't that what these kinds of regional alliances are meant for?
I think the thing with the CSTO is that we mistakenly think of it as a regional security organization, but I think it's much more about the creation of an alternative order with Russia at the center in a kind of a hub and spoke system. And for its members, it's actually about managing the relationship with Russia. Each of the CSTO members has a very asymmetric relationship with Russia. There are some perks and benefits. So from Armenia's perspective, being a CSTO member allowed for discounted arms purchases and all of the upkeep and maintenance and spare parts that follows in the wake of those kinds of arms procurement deals. But in 2020, that when Armenia sort of called on the CSTO to act as a regional security organization and to come to its defense, that didn't happen. So the contrast with the operation in Kazakhstan was quite striking. And to put it very crudely, the CSTO seems to be much more of a structure to protect its elites from social civic unrest in their countries. So, Armenia's CSTO membership sort of presents it with the challenge. You want to deal with this structural dependency on Russia. You're a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and those memberships constrain you from diversifying your foreign policy in any other direction. And that's the kind of the fundamental dilemma that Armenia faces. And I think the way that it's tried to deal with this is, rather than going into or engaging in an open confrontation with Russia, it's engaging in a kind of strategy of what you might call strategic silence or strategic shirking.
In early 2023, after Russia had handed control of the Lachin corridor over, the Armenian Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, made several statements indicating his dissatisfaction with the CSTO, expressing a now pretty widely held sentiment in the country, and in a somewhat symbolic move, pulled Armenia out of the planned CSTO military exercises on its territory. But as of now, Armenia hasn't formally submitted a request to actually leave the organization. So why not pull the trigger on this one?
Simply, it's a more passive strategy of simply withdrawing, but without triggering wires of confrontation with Russia. And I think this is symptomatic of a broader policy of how can Armenia manage this very asymmetric relationship with Russia, which produced all of these structural dependencies. It wants to pivot in other directions, but if Russia were to take off the gloves, Armenia would be extremely vulnerable indeed. So I think this sort of frozen membership is likely to continue. And I think we're going to see the alter ego of this in Georgia's EU accession process. So I think we're going to see these smaller states spending a long time waiting to leave these organizations, but with no clear outcome that might trigger a conflict with a larger power.
But if Armenia were to leave the CSTO, where would that leave the Russian military base in the country? As currently Russia still has the 73rd Separate Motor Rifle Brigade and the 988th Anti-Aircraft Missile Regiment, alongside the 3,624th Air Base, all still sitting in Armenia across Yerevan and Gyumri. And with those 3,000 troops still sitting in Armenia, I'm sure there's probably some pressure from Russian military command to divert some of these forces away. After all, the Southern Military District, the one that oversees all forces in Armenia, is also currently in charge defending Crimea and the occupied Russian territories in Ukraine. So there's probably going to be some pressure from Southern Military Command to pull some of these troops and use them elsewhere. And from the other side, there's probably pressure from some anti-Russian activists inside Armenia to pull some of these troops out. So if there was a situation where Armenia were to pull out of the CSTO, do you think we'd also see Russia closing down its base here in Armenia?
So in terms of the future, the base is there until 2044. I suspect that the fate of that base will depend a lot on outcomes in Ukraine. But for all of this talk of decoupling from Russia and distancing from Russia, Russia will remain a tremendously important state for Armenia in any scenario.
So turning away from military affairs for a bit, and obviously the war in Ukraine has had some impacts on the trade dynamic between the two. So can you elaborate a bit on what has changed between them?
Obviously, Armenia was impacted by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. On the one hand, we see that Armenian trade with Russia has increased as a result of war. Trade between Armenia and Russia in 2022 doubled to $5.3 billion US dollars, with Russia accounting for 51% of all of Armenia's exports. And then in 2023, the figures surged to 7.3 billion US dollars altogether, with Russia at 33% of trade. So a lot of that's re-exports to Russia. So this points to continued deepening dependency on Russia in the field of trade. But one quite surprising outcome following the Second Karabakh War in 2020 was that Armenia actually invested in a new arms supplies deal with Russia in 2021. But as a result of the problems with Russia's own capacity to supply for its own operations in Ukraine, we've seen a precipitous collapse of Russian arms supplies to Armenia from something in the region 96% prior to 2020 to around 10% of Armenia's arms supplies today. And that 10% could also be legacy supplies from previous deals. So there's been a kind of an enforced diversification of Armenia's linkages in the field of security. It has been looking for new partnerships, in particular with France, with India, with the Czech Republic, with Greece.
With these arms purchases making headlines across the defense community, with Armenia going on to acquire 19 155mm towed howitzers from India, as well as several Pinnaker MLRS systems, as well as some Arkash air defense systems. Then, partly due to the unavailability of Russian stocks, with Armenia then going on to purchase 35 self-propelled artillery systems from the French, sparking widespread backlash from Azerbaijan toward Paris, even prompting Baku to try and stir trouble within the French gas market and fund separatist groups in some of France's Pacific Island overseas territories, all in an effort to prevent France from helping Armenia rearm itself. Now, we've seen Macron and a few Western leaders making pretty serious efforts to strengthen their relationships here in Armenia, but considering that Azerbaijan and Turkey are still much larger trading partners to the EU, how far do you think the West would be willing to go to try and replace the position that Russia currently holds within Armenia?
We're in a very different era now. The scope for an Armenian-Western relationship is not the same as it was for Georgia after the Rose Revolution and in that earlier historical era. So rather than a pivot to the West, I think that the key thing for Armenia is to pivot to the world, as it were, and to pivot in as many different directions as it can to maximize different relationships, rather than still behaving as if it was in a bipolar context where it can either be a Russian or a Western client. what's needed, in my humble opinion, is for a foregrounding of Armenian sovereignty and statehood at the center of a multipolar foreign policy.
So as part of this European outreach, the EU is also paid to send in civilian peacekeepers to oversee sections of the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But what sort of impact do you think these peacekeepers have had?
The other key change is that the EU has deployed a CSDP monitoring mission, Common Security and Defense Policy mission, to monitor the borders of Armenia. It's a civilian mission, it's not armed. This came after this 2-day war in September, with strong influence from French President Emmanuel Macron. It started out as a small 40-member mission, and that evolved into a larger mission with 209 in a subsequent amendment. So the mission covers all of the borders. It has a number of forward operating bases, and each of these has 7 to 11 monitors. So this is a dramatic expansion relative to the preceding decades of monitoring capacity of the ceasefire. And when you remember that the Minsk group had the personal representative of the chairman in office and 5 field representatives to monitor this enormous space of the line of contact. Principal problem with the mission is that it is only deployed on one side of the border. Azerbaijan did not agree to have EU monitors on its soil. And Azerbaijan has consistently indicated its displeasure with the deployment of the mission. There have been accusations in Azerbaijani media that the EU mission is engaged in what it calls binoculars diplomacy, bringing foreign visitors, foreign dignitaries and journalists to the border with Azerbaijan and staring into Azerbaijani territory with binoculars, essentially reinforcing the notion that Azerbaijan is the source of threat. At the same time, the mission has a confidence-building mandate, and I think this is another one of the challenges because I don't think there is an environment right now where a bilateral or cross-conflict confidence-building measure could realistically be undertaken. With all of that said, the mission's deployment has coincided with a dramatic decline in ceasefire violations. The major incident of this year took place in January in an area where EU monitors had limited access. So I think the sense is that the mission is contributing to security, but I think we're still some way from process of predictable, stable pattern of confidence building.
Here's where things get particularly complicated. With the Azeri troops already occupying some of the villages within the Armenian territory, Russian bases and Russian patrols still being carried out within the country, EU observers now along the border, and Azerbaijan moving the goalposts on what it hopes to achieve here in Armenia. Now, before we unpack this, because it is quite complicated, I want everyone to think back to those 4 tall rectangles we talked about earlier on, with the first on the left being Turkey, the second across being Nakhchivan, which is part of Azerbaijan, the third being Armenia, and the fourth being Azerbaijan proper, and Iran running along the bottom of all 4 rectangles. Because now we run into the issue of the Zangezur corridor, because with Karabakh ticked off Azerbaijan's list, Azerbaijan now wants to connect itself sitting in rectangle 4 all the way through to rectangle 2, as currently all trade between these 2 rectangles has to either go through Georgia, then into Turkey, and then back into Nakhchivan, or has to go through Iran. And with Baku hoping to connect up with Nakhchivan, and Turkey hoping to connect directly through to the Caspian Sea, all sides here, apart from Armenia, really want that corridor running through Armenia. As in the past, since Armenia and Azerbaijan have disliked each other to such an unfathomable capacity, for quite some time the borders have been closed and the corridor inaccessible. Now the corridor between Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan is only about 20 miles wide, so it is quite short, running along the very southern extremity of Armenia. Now a little while back, Azerbaijan was making moves and putting out indications that it may be considering moving troops into the Zangezur corridor, whilst the Armenian forces were still in very bad shape from the last conflict, even going as far as moving armoured troops and vehicles up toward the border. And whilst events seemed to be heading to the brink of war, in the end, Iran was the one to step in and convince Azerbaijan not to go through with this, with the Iranians hoping not to lose their direct border with Armenia, as that border with Armenia connects them directly to Georgia, and from Georgia directly to Russia. Now, with Iran offering an alternative corridor for the Azeris to use, and a lot of the heat seeming to come out of the situation, a lot of people seem to turn away from the situation. But what do you think the Azeris' long-term goals here are?
Well, yeah, I think there are different scenarios for how Azerbaijan might go about this. I think the military option wouldn't necessarily be the primary scenario. I would have thought that there could be an alternative pathway to basically induce Armenia to cede this transit route on the terms that Azerbaijan wants through lower level escalations, the kind of thing that we saw in 2021, 2022 along the international border, creating that pressure. We don't know what agreements have been reached behind closed doors between Presidents Putin and Aliyev. It seems hard to believe that Azerbaijan wants to see Russian border service control over this corridor. It may also be that there is a pragmatic recognition that somehow Russia has to be included into any Zangezur corridor scheme to make it work over the long term and to keep Russia on board. This is something that Bajani analysts have said to me many times over the years, that there is a belief that one of the reasons why Azerbaijan lost the First Karabakh War so disastrously was the failure to manage the relationship with Russia. And I think managing that relationship is a key priority for Azerbaijan's foreign policy today. So my sense is that Azerbaijan's preference would certainly be to go that route. Other kinds of pressure from Russia to uphold the terms of Article 9 of the ceasefire statement from November 2020, which mandates a Russian role in that. And then the question is, well, what might Iran do? Because Iran has been the key sort of veto player in terms of the Zangezur corridor. So much depends, of course, on what happens in the Middle East, what kind of situation Iran is going to be, whether Iran will really be in a position to impose a veto as it has done so far. Iran is offering its own sort of Aras corridor, so access through Iranian territory. Azerbaijani policymakers have said in conversations that I've had with them that they would prefer to have both, because neither Armenia nor Iran is seen as a reliable partner for Azerbaijan in such a strategic project. But I also don't exclude the fact that we may not see a resolution of this for a long time to come, because even if a military option or a pressure is successfully applied to Armenia to cede the corridor, the long-term viability of a transit route enacted against the will of two countries along whose borders this corridor runs, one really has to question how viable that's going to be. And if there was the use of force involved, then surely that would discredit the Zangezur corridor, the Middle Corridor project with it, in terms of international investment and Western presence. So yeah, one might argue that that's less of an obstacle than it has been in the past. So what I suspect we may start to see in the months following COP29 is experimentation with perhaps some small-scale ceasefire violations, small-scale pressures to test the waters, to see what kind of reactions are elicited, and on that basis, we'll see what direction pressure for the Zangezur corridor takes.
So what do you think the end point of all this is then?
My answer to that is a stable endpoint for the possible preconditions that Azerbaijan might demand in order to sign an agreement that would then free up the process for Armenian-Turkish normalization. The current discussion is very much focused on the removal of this language in the constitution referring to the Declaration of Independence and unification with Nagorno-Karabakh. Pashinyan has said that this is not in principle a problem. There are autonomous and independent reasons for wanting to revise the constitution in Armenia. But this is going to be a long-term process. It would also be a politically fraught process that would take us through to 2027 at least. But we've also heard a number of other demands that could be tabled as preconditions for signature to an agreement. One of these is Armenia's formal cooperation in the dissolution of the Minsk group and the mediation architecture that was set up within the framework of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in the 1990s to mediate in this conflict. Let's remember that the OSCE and the Minsk group is still the formal holder of the only mandate to discuss the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think from Azerbaijan's perspective, it's very desirable to see that liquidated and completely wrapped up so that there is no international space or forum that even on paper has a mandate to discuss this issue, which Azerbaijan sees as closed. Other issues that have been raised are the withdrawal of the EU mission to Armenia and the potential for there to be some kind of formal limitations on the scope and arms potential of the Armenian military. And I think over time, we could see other factors, other asks coming into this. So the way that I would describe this dynamic is that, when we think back over all of those years of the Minsk process up to September 2023, September of last year, Azerbaijan was negotiating for issues of vital national interest, for its sovereignty, for its territorial integrity, regarding the internal composition of the Azerbaijani state, and regarding the presence of foreign military forces in the form of a peacekeeping contingent on its territory. All of those issues have now been solved by force. And what's being negotiated today is a whole range of secondary issues emanating from the Second Karabakh War and its aftermath. So in a way, what we're talking about, if I could put it very crudely, is not vital interests, but nice to haves. And for this reason, I don't expect any rapid signing of an agreement. I don't expect that we are close to a final signing, because I think this temptation to maximize is very, very strong. And because Azerbaijan enjoys at the moment complete military preponderance and dominance, it doesn't have a reason to rush into an agreement.
And what about the relationship with Russia? Where do you see that going forward?
I think that there has been a shattering of the long-established kind of paradigm. You could call it a rescue fantasy. That was the key sort of symbolic narrative that Russia rescues Armenians and in security, and in return, they participate willingly in Russian or Soviet state-building schemes. As I mentioned, there has been disillusionment ongoing with Russia, dating back to at least 2016. I think the latest figures were at least a third of Armenians see Russia as the principal threat to the country. So in that sense, there's no going back to that previous very sort of romanticized and mythologized relationship. But with that said, I think there are other structural changes that have come out of the Ukraine war that are going to stay with us. One of them being the structural strategic cooperation between Russia and Iran, the very evolved relationship between Russia and Turkey, and these three states forming kind of a regionalized axis around the South Caucasus and having a greater interest in managing the region according to those interests and managing competition amongst them. So I think the Russian-Armenian relationship has changed, but so has the broader dynamic of regional powers surrounding the region and having greater capacity to squeeze out alternative poles of power. So while that Russian-Armenian relationship has changed, there isn't anything to replace it.
So it's clear that Russia is no longer the trusted partner it once was. But whilst Russia's domestic support has somewhat shrunk, the threat from Turkey and Azerbaijan, is only growing, meaning that Yerevan has to act, and Yerevan has to make some very tough choices. So who else can they turn to? What options do they have? And who have they been approaching to help protect themselves in this new dynamic? Well, to answer that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. The Middleman.
It's surprising, really. Karabakh is obviously a place that's got a long Armenian history. People have lived there for centuries. It's a place which is very important to Armenians. But I think Armenians are so traumatized by everything that's happened in the last few years that, of course, there is fallout, but there is surprisingly little domestic backlash.
Thomas Taval is a senior fellow for Carnegie Europe, specializing in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region. In addition to this, he's also the author of The Caucasus, an Introduction, as well as Black Garden, Armenia and Azerbaijan Through Peace and War. Prior to his role with Carnegie, Tom also worked for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., and before that, Tom also worked as a journalist covering this region for the BBC, and before that was based in Moscow, writing for the Moscow Times, the Times of London, and The Economist, reporting on domestic Russian politics and the situation in Chechnya. So we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
I think most anger has been directed against the Russians and the Russian who failed to protect the people of Karabakh as they see it from Azerbaijan. Lots of speculation that they did a deal with Azerbaijan, and mainly because the current government really doesn't have much opposition. They've ridden this out fairly well. I think that's in part because people are more worried about the fate of Armenia itself rather than of Karabakh. Obviously, there's a humanitarian impact, 100,000 plus people fleeing Karabakh, most of them now in Armenia, and that obviously has an impact in a small society.
So to begin with, let's take a look at these two states. And where they currently sit, how would you compare the military position of Azerbaijan versus Armenia? And how much do you think this impacts the decision-making of the two sides?
Azerbaijan is much stronger. Azerbaijan has the Turkish alliance, all of which means that really Armenia's best option is for a negotiated peace with Azerbaijan, and that's where Mr. Pashinyan's been basically putting all his energy in the last year or two, giving up several Armenian positions in order to do that, including recognizing Karabakh as being part of Azerbaijan. And I think the calculation there is that only if it has open borders with Azerbaijan and Turkey and peace with Azerbaijan will Armenia be able to reduce its dependence on Russia and move forward. I think it's a strategy that makes sense, but the trouble is that it's the other players, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Russia, who have more cards to play, who will have more to say whether this peace actually works out.
So what are Azerbaijan's aims here? What's their long-term goal with Armenia?
I think would like a peace agreement if it suited them, but they're perfectly prepared to use force as well if that also suits their purposes. Azerbaijan hosting in November the COP29 big international climate summit. So they're on their best behavior at the moment, lots of international guests coming there. I think Azerbaijan also, like a lot of people watching the US election, I think they regard the Biden administration as being supportive of the Armenians. They think probably if Trump gets back to the White House, there'll be less US engagement in the region and a bit more room for maneuver.
Okay, let's say for the sake of the argument that Azerbaijan chooses not to use force and instead sometime after the COP summit are willing to come to Armenia and offer a peace deal to solve this issue once and for all, whether that deals for the Zangezur corridor or just the recognition of national borders. What do you think the likelihood is that Azerbaijan would be willing to come to Armenia with a deal had in hand, considering that A, they have a much stronger military position at the moment, and there will be forces within the government, military and security services that feel they could probably get a better outcome using force, whilst at the same time improving the military's position within the political structure, and B, the fact that President Aliyev has been quite successful in using this conflict to rally the Azeri people around him toward a common enemy. And this is important because Aliyev has a lot to lose at the moment. After all, Aliyev, who's the president of Azerbaijan, has made great efforts to place his wife, Mehriban Aliyeva, as the country's vice president, and is now currently grooming his son to take over his role. And just since 2020, we've seen a significant rollback of civil rights within the country, with Azerbaijan falling in the rankings within Freedom House so rapidly that they now sit between Belarus and Afghanistan on the Freedom Index at a score of just 7 out of 100. Now, it's very clear looking at the past with Azerbaijan that nationalism has played a big role in helping Aliyev maintain his hold on power. So given these factors, do you think Aliyev would actually be willing to give up this lever he can pull to try and rally the people together in tough times? Or do you think he actually will genuinely seek a peace deal with Yerevan here?
Well, this is the big question. Will Azerbaijan be prepared to do a deal? At some point, Azerbaijan does want its corridor across to Nakhchivan and Turkey, across Armenian territory. And the modalities of that have been discussed in a way that I think could suit all sides. I think that the Russians here are a problem. The Russians really do want to control that road and rail link when it reopens. But everyone understands that for the Azerbaijani leadership, this is a conflict it's very hard to let go of. They've been fighting the Armenians for 30 plus years. There's been a rally around the flag effect. It's been the one thing the leaders can tell the public that they can rely on, that Armenia is the enemy and we need to defend ourselves. If you finally do a deal with Armenia, you're in new territory and suddenly Azerbaijan is maybe less unified and maybe the president's popularity begins to fall from that point. Also, given that oil and gas revenues are not going to last. These are the kind of choices you're making if you're the leader of Azerbaijan, and maybe another reason why Azerbaijan is still playing for time.
The Zangezur corridor issue is a lot more complicated than most people probably think it is, because at first glance, well, simply allowing Azeri traffic to transit through the corridor and into its own exclave seems perfectly reasonable, innocuous even. There's quite a lot of countries who have similar arrangements. So why is it then that Armenia is so hesitant to reopen the corridor? Well, the answer is not what lies in the initial stage, but what comes after the corridor is opened. As because of the rhetoric and venom that currently sits between these two countries, following the border being opened, there will be an almost inevitable series of events to take place, where as soon as Azeri trucks and goods enter, even if they are just civilian trucks carrying standard consumer goods, it will only be a matter of time before some disillusioned Armenian, whether they be a refugee from Karabakh or simply just an Armenian nationalist, will attack those Azeri-marked trucks. And whether it's simply just an angry teen throwing rocks or an older man using a rifle, the response from Baku would also then be inevitable. As then Baku would likely amp up the danger to its own people and demand the right to militarily protect its own convoys transiting the corridor, which again, on the surface, sounds kind of reasonable. But the moment that happens, you now have Azeri troops sitting within the corridor, and Armenia having no real way to remove them from it. And once we cross that line, well, things begin to escalate quickly. As from there, the obvious move for Baku will be to prevent any Armenians from entering the corridor, probably under the suspicion that Armenians traveling toward the corridor are simply terrorists. And so now we block the corridor from the Armenians, or simply using environmental grounds that they did to the Zangezur corridor back in 2023. And then from there, it's not really a huge jump to start to begin to set up encampments within the corridor, under claims of it simply just being easier than transiting all the way back to Azerbaijan at the end of each day. And once those encampments are there, and Armenia has no way to remove them, well, those encampments can very quickly become bases or patrol stations. And you can see how once the doors open, it's very easy for Azerbaijan to simply slowly increase its presence here in the corridor. And short of launching a full-scale invasion, it becomes nearly impossible to ever put that genie back in the bottle. So if that is the case, how likely do you think it is that A, that corridor would come under attack, and B, that if it did, we'd see this series of escalating movements?
In an ideal world, the two countries should be trading, trucks and convoys should be going back and forth across each other's territory, but we've got a legacy of 30 plus years of conflict, people who haven't been talking to each other for all that time. And so, yeah, there's a real danger that just a few young men with a bag of rocks or stones could disrupt things quite badly. They could smash the windows of a train or a truck. So this is a problem that has to be dealt with and won't be dealt with very easily.
Well, the other party very interested in what happens here in the Zangezur corridor is obviously Iran, with Iran effectively being the main party preventing Azerbaijan from going in and launching its own military solution at the end of last year, by both threatening to send arms, munitions and support for the Armenians, and also offering Azerbaijan the ability to use Iranian territory to transit between Azerbaijan proper and Nakhchivan, with the Iranian corridor running parallel just below the Armenian one. So what are Iran's aims here, both in the Zangezur corridor and in Armenia as a whole?
I think the Iranians regard this as their neighborhood, as their backyard. They haven't been very effective in doing that since the fall of the Soviet Union. It's been very much the Europeans, Russians, Americans who've been there. But the Iranians, in an ideal world, would like to be much more influential in this region. And I think they fear a kind of Azerbaijani Turkish takeover of the region in which they don't get much leverage. So in that sense, it's important for them to keep the border with Armenia open. It's also their route north to Russia. A lot of historical rivalry between Azerbaijan and Iran has been exacerbated by the crisis in the Middle East, given that Azerbaijan sends about 30 to 40% of Israel's oil. So Israel getting a large oil exports from Azerbaijan, and Israel in turn being one of Azerbaijan's largest supplier of weapons. So that's an additional source of tension between Azerbaijan and Iran.
Now, Iran is obviously a very big player in this story and is quite an important partner for the Armenians, but still, it's nowhere near as influential, both militarily or via trade, as Russia is to Armenia. For Russia, their relationship with Armenia is complicated, to say the least. As whilst militarily, Armenia's position and bases do give Russia a solid foothold here in the Caucasus, The usefulness of these positions has been somewhat diminished in recent years by Russia building up its other positions in South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and in Tartus in Syria. Even when it comes to the CSTO, Armenia actually only ends up making up about 1.15% of the total military spending within the CSTO, making it a fairly small player within the grand scheme of things. And even pulling away from the military angle here and focusing back toward trade, here Russia also finds itself in an interesting conundrum. As well as politically, it is much closer to the Armenian government than it is to the Azeri one, and does import slightly more from Armenia than it does from Azerbaijan. It exports significantly more to Azerbaijan than it does to Armenia, particularly in recent years, where reports indicate that large amounts of Russian oil and gas have been sold into Azerbaijan to then be repackaged and re-exported into the European market as a way of circumventing sanctions. With the fact that Azerbaijan is also a gas exporter, giving it some plausible deniability about the entire situation, a function that Armenia cannot provide. And even if we want to zoom out a bit and start talking about the secondary players, looking at the trade numbers these days, Russia does a little bit over 3 times as much trade with Turkey and Azerbaijan as it does with Iran and Armenia, making Turkey and Azerbaijan far more important to the Russian economy overall. So with all that in mind, what do you think Russia's long-term goals are here in Armenia? How far are they willing to go to maintain the kind of relationship they had prior to 2020?
I think Russia has its own agenda here. Russia does not want to see a complete Azerbaijani takeover, but then Russia's also very distracted. So I think it's very much up to the Armenians themselves to figure out what they want. And this really is the big question. What are Russia's intentions? We really don't know. Again, we come back to Ukraine, but I think mainly what are Azerbaijan's intentions? I think very much an impression that Azerbaijan is playing for time here.
If push came to shove, do you think the Russians would come to the aid of the Armenians in a similar way that they came to the aid of the Kazakhs in 2022?
I think it's very unlikely that Russia would come to the aid of Pashinyan. They keep a kind of polite but frosty relationship. They talk, but there's absolutely no love lost between Moscow and Yerevan at the moment. It's pretty damn clear to Moscow that the Armenians are moving west. And I'm sure if there was a good alternative opposition leader, that the Russians would be backing that leader. There are 1 or 2 people, but they're not very strong at the moment. There's occasional rumors of a military coup, things like that. It's all very murky. I think the Russians are really too busy to plan anything serious. But in an ideal world, Moscow would like to say goodbye to this Pashinyan government and try and have a friendly government there in Yerevan.
Well, you talked about Armenia moving west there, but with the board set in the way it currently is, looking at Armenia's trade and what options it has, do you think it actually can ditch Russia in the short term?
I don't think anyone in Armenia thinks that they can do without Russia in the short and probably the medium term as well, when you're looking at this heavy reliance on Russian gas, Russian imports. Another thing that's going on is the contract for the Armenian nuclear power station, which supplies 1/3 of Armenia's electricity, is up for renewal. The Armenians are talking to the Americans, but that is currently managed by the Russian company Rosatom, who supplies the nuclear fuel. So that's another very big deal. So I think the Armenians are pretty realistic that they can't just pivot towards the West. I think what they're looking for is a diversification of relationships, trying to kind of end this monopoly of relying on Russia. I think that's the right strategy, and I think Western partners have some ideas. But again, we come back to the central issue, which is when Armenia is so isolated, when its borders with Azerbaijan and Turkey are closed, its options are pretty limited. Without a peace agreement with Azerbaijan, without normalizations of relations with Turkey, there's only so much you can do.
So how would you summarize the change in the relationship between Armenia and Russia during this period?
Well, if you look at one opinion poll, IRI says in 2019 that 93% of Armenians thought relations with Russia were good. And in 2023, after the takeover of Karabakh, that number had fallen to 31%. So there's a widespread feeling that the Russians were supposed to be our protector, our security patron. They deployed this peacekeeping force in 2020 in Karabakh itself. And we know from other situations that generally when the Russian peacekeepers arrive, they don't tend to leave. But this time was different. This obviously is all to do with Ukraine, Russia's own calculations vis-a-vis the South Caucasus. Maybe it's South Caucasus, I guess, is less important to Russia as a security front, more as an economic front. And in that way, Azerbaijan is a more important partner. But certainly a massive change within Armenia towards Russia, in which this is kind of exhibit number one. Well, some changes are quite significant. Some things haven't changed at all. So certainly in terms of sentiment, in terms of government attitudes and policies, you've seen Prime Minister Pashinyan spending time in the United States, in Brussels, meeting European leaders, publicly commenting that he's going to leave the Russian security organization, the CSTO. Russian arms supplies have dropped to very, very little, less than 10% now of weapons coming to Armenia come from Russia. So in all those respects, it's a very different kind of relationship. Armenia is still in all those Russian-led organizations for sure, but the mood is very different. I think the main non-difference, the main similarity is when it comes to the economy. Armenia is still heavily reliant on Russian energy, Russian wheat, Russian gas, Russian nuclear fuel, and there's not much that Western partners, even if they want to, and I think they do want to, can do in a situation where Armenia is basically so geographically isolated.
So we touched on this a little bit earlier on in the episode, but what is your overall take on the increasing arms sales and military cooperation taking place between Armenia and countries like France and India? Do you think this is a long-term move by Armenia to shift itself away from the cheaper Russian equipment and towards the more expensive NATO standard kit? Or is it simply, on Armenia's part, looking for any port in the storm? Whilst on France's part, Macron just trying to position himself as a major military power with global influence in Europe. Or do you think partners like Iran and India and France are simply just trying to give Armenia whatever they can in order to provide some level of military deterrence in hopes of dissuading Azerbaijan from ever launching another attack to conquer the rest of Armenia? As if they did so, it would place a lot of these countries in a pretty awkward position. Why do you think France and India are putting this much effort into rearming the Armenian state?
I think that the French are definitely very heavily invested in Armenia in a way that also means their relationship with Azerbaijan is pretty much broken down. They are sending some weapons to Armenia. I don't think we should overestimate how much. I think India is probably more significant.
So what's your reaction to all these stories of Armenia eventually looking to join NATO, or in the medium term, possibly even looking to join the EU?
I think a lot of people are getting a long way ahead of themselves. The EU is opening dialogue with Armenia about some issues like visa liberalization and so on, about infrastructure projects and so on. But just look at Georgia. Georgia is about to have an election in which things could go pretty badly, in which it could really veer off the European path if the current government and current ruling party stays in power, which is quite probable. In that case, you'd be looking at a region where Armenia's kind of main outlet to the world via Georgia, via the Black Sea, is turning away from Europe. And it would be very hard for the EU to fully invest in Armenia if Georgia is going in the opposite direction. Even if they would like to, there just simply isn't the capacity.
It is notable, though, that throughout all of this, Pashinyan has managed to maintain the leadership of the country. So how has he managed to hold power even while sitting at the helm of some of Armenia's darkest moments?
I think what helps the government is, one, the behavior of the Russians, which has alienated the public at large. Two, that there's no real credible pro-Russian opposition. The opposition is basically formed of previous guys like former President Robert Kocharyan, who have no public standing. And three, I think everyone's a bit tired of chaos in Armenia. There's not much appetite to organize street protests, to get people out on the streets and bring down this government. I think there is a consensus that you look towards the next election in 2026. There's not great enthusiasm for the Pashinyan government, but I think a lot of passive support, the people who would rather support the government by default because they don't want any more turbulence in the country, and despite grumbling about it in private. I think that is saving the Pashinyan government from anything worse happening.
I see a lot of people characterizing Armenia's position as something akin to having hit rock bottom and now on the way up. But how would you characterize Azerbaijan's medium to long-term position? Whilst Armenia might be on the upswing, where do you see the Azeris going forward?
Azerbaijan is not as rich as it was 10, 15 years ago. Revenues from oil and gas have been going down. So they have some questions to ask themselves in the future. Actually, if you look at GDP per capita, which is an interesting measure, Azerbaijan is actually now behind both Armenia and Georgia. They just happen to have a lot of revenues earned from state oil fund. They also still have quite a powerful army. So there's no question that if it did come to another military engagement, there's only one winner there, and that's Azerbaijan. So the Armenians are not going to deter them on the battlefield. The Armenians are going to deter them because of international solidarity behind them and the cost that Azerbaijan would incur. The more frayed the international legal order, the stronger Azerbaijan feels. But the more that there is Western engagement and pushback in that region, the more Azerbaijan will be inclined to eventually do a deal with Armenia.
So I guess the final question I have here is, what do you think the best case scenario looks like for Armenia? Is it something akin to the Ukraine war ending and Russia returning to a position of power here in the South Caucasus, effectively a return to the pre-2020 position? Do you think it's cozying up more with someone like Iran, hoping that Iran is enough of a deterrent against any aggression from Azerbaijan or Turkey? Or do you think it's finally making peace with Azerbaijan and Turkey and hoping that cooperation will satisfy both parties enough to not seek territorial expansion anytime in the future? Going forward, what do you think the best case scenario is here for Armenia?
I think what we're really looking at as a good scenario for Armenia is a kind of diversification of its foreign policy and its number of trading partners, number of security partners, looking at some of the Gulf states, perhaps looking at India, looking at the European Union, looking at the United States, still obviously some quite important connections with Russia. And I don't think there's any one partner who would replace Russia, but several partners who can do their bit. And in the most benign scenario, Armenia-Turkey normalization works. That border eventually opens, and Armenia actually has Turkey next door as a neighbor, and eastern Turkey, which is quite poor, which will actually, I think, benefit economically from that border opening as well. So that's the benign scenario. But the trouble is there's a lot of short-term problems with Russia, Azerbaijan, and Turkey to get through before you can reach a scenario like that.
These next few days, months, and possibly even years will set the course for the country for the next few decades, as the time period right now is a pretty unique set of circumstances, and whether due to economics, a change in the war in Ukraine, or Baku's relationship with Europe continuing to shrink, for Pashinyan, he'll have to thread this needle so incredibly delicately, trying to not only keep the Russians on side, hoping that their imports and exports that power the Armenian economy still continue, but that Russia will continue to trade at this level with Armenia even if the European markets open up again. He needs to try and resolve the border disputes and historical tensions with Turkey, whilst at the same time trying not to turn his back on centuries of Armenian pain and history. He needs to try and ensure that the corridor north into Georgia also remains a viable option for the Armenians, simultaneously trying to maintain close relationships with the Russia-leaning government in Georgia and the Western-leaning population in Georgia. And then regarding Azerbaijan, Pashinyan also has to simultaneously not forget about what has happened to the Armenians and the people living in Karabakh, and not give away that sense of nationalism that can unite Armenians behind something, but also try and take the heat out of the situation enough that Armenia no longer feels like it's on the verge of an imminent invasion, since impending invasions tend to be bad for government confidence and bad for foreign investment. Pashinyan knows he needs to open up some of these investment routes, but also knows that opening up things like the Zangezur corridor can very quickly become a problem for the Armenians, and that genie is pretty hard to get back in the bottle. On top of that, he also has to keep Iran on side with the Armenian project, giving Tehran reasons to stay invested in the Armenian cause and act as a possible deterrent to Azeri aggression, but at the same time not getting so close to Tehran that it drives away Western investment or antagonizes Baku or Ankara. With all of this, either hoping to simply just buy enough time to rebuild a military deterrence and return to the status quo of pre-2020, or try and forge a new path ahead for the Armenian people. Pashinyan has to manage all of this, whilst also maintaining the support of his own citizens and attempting to convince them to accept what was just a few years ago completely unacceptable. Pashinyan is facing an endless run of tough decisions for a tough country living in a tougher neighborhood. And from what it seems, the country is likely in for some tough times. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. As I said, it's been 5 years of doing this program. And if you've been around for any part of that 5-year journey, I just can't thank you enough. To myself, to the team, to everyone else, it really does mean a lot. But enough with all that, as I want to move straight on to a few big points. The obvious one being that we haven't released an episode for the last couple of weeks. The reason being that for the last 2 weeks, we've been focusing on our project, the Armed Forces of Central Asia, a full collaborative analysis of the military and security services of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan, produced in conjunction with the Red Line, the Oxford Society for Central Asian Affairs, Forecast International, Military Periscope, and a whole bunch of other organizations. With the first full 180-page chapter focusing on the armed forces of Tajikistan alongside our full interactive maps marking all of the military locations across Tajikistan going live last week. And so we didn't bombard everyone, we hoped you'd take a cycle off the Red Line and instead focus on reading the report. And for those of you who have checked out the report, or simply have an interest in Central Asia and the former Soviet states, I'm glad to also say that our next episode of the Red Line is part 2 of our mini-series, with the next episode focusing on the findings of our war games, effectively working with a whole bunch of military, logistics, and security experts to stress test these militaries and see where they come apart. And the results have been nothing but fascinating, to say the least. So the next episode in this feed will be part 2 of the mini-series we started back in June. But for now, if you want to read that full report, or just generally be up to date with everything we have going on here, you can find all of our info and links on our Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me, I'm on the handle @MikeHilliottOz. Oz is in Australia. This show can only function with the support of our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep the show going. And speaking of our amazing Patreons, this week I'd like to thank Florian Vogel, Ryan Passaud, Caspian, Willie and Adir, A, Eclone, KBH, Todd, Jack Binns, Ayman El Masri, and Kevin Pierce, who are the latest patrons to sign up or increase their donations as of time of recording. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like these guys, and we simply just cannot thank them enough. But if you feel you can spare a couple of dollars and you want special access to videos like our full presentation, exploring the outcomes of a second Russo-Georgian war, or a full briefing on the individuals who are closest to Vladimir Putin, or even our upcoming live stream this weekend, giving you a step-by-step guide on how to pull off a coup, well, you can sign up to our Patreon by clicking the links in the description. Myself and the rest of the team would greatly appreciate it. As usual though, here are our 3 book recommendations. The first is Black Garden by this week's guest, Thomas Duval, for a great history on the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The second, also by one of this week's guests, is Armenia's Velvet Revolution, Authoritarian Decline and Civil Resistance in a Multipolar World by Lawrence Brewers, looking at the state of modern Armenian politics. And the third is Near Abroad, Putin, the West, and the Contest of Ukraine and the Caucasus by friend of the show, Gerard Toll, for a look at Russia's strategy and influence throughout this region of the world. I want to thank this week's guests, Olesa Vartanyan, Lawrence Brewers, and Thomas Duval. All of you were amazingly helpful as always, with Lawrence actually being on that piece we put together on this all those years ago. I also want to give an additional thanks to the primary researchers for this piece, them being Nate Ostiller and Andrew Gundel, our resident Russia and Caucasus experts. On top of those guys, I want to give a thanks to the rest of the team as well, them being the producer Cameron Gale, Jack Shankman, the production manager, Daniela Givello, Nate Ostiller, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Dolan May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Laurence Van Kierbilk, Andrew Gundel, Isaac Gibbs, Scott Missler-Ferguson, and Sean Cottelem, our research assistants and writers, Jamie Tano, our media director, Raul Devanarayanan, our OSINT analyst, Francis Leach, our director of breaking news, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari and Alexander Vulgarten, our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, Alexi Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Joe Hawthorne, our audio cleaner, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. There is absolutely no way we could be here after 5 years without having such a great team behind the show, and I really can't thank them enough. But with all that said, I also want to thank you for checking out the show, and let you know that the Red Line will be back in a few weeks with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.